Hello and welcome back to the Brit Lit Book Club. I'm Vanessa and I'm so glad you're here today because this episode is a deeply personal one for me. And I think by the end of it you'll understand why. Before we dive in, let's talk tea. Today I'm brewing a proper Scottish breakfast tea. It's rich, malty, full-bodied cup that smells honestly like a cold morning in a warm kitchen. If you've ever spent time in Scotland, and I hope by the end of this episode you'll be very motivated to do exactly that, you'll know that tea up there is not optional, it's structural. It is load-bearing. So put your kettle on, settle in, and let's begin. Today we're talking about Sir Walter Scott. And my thesis for this entire episode, which I'll be coming back to again, is this. Before there was Outlander, there was Walter Scott. And he didn't just write about romantic Scotland. He literally invented it. Now, next week I have a very exciting episode coming your way. I'll be sitting down with historian Alex Dold to talk about Scottish history in depth. And I want today to be the perfect literary prelude to that conversation. Because what Scott did, and what historians have been wrestling with for 200 years, is this fascinating tension between the Scotland that actually existed and the Scotland he made the entire world fall in love with. So hold that thought. We're going to come back to it. But first, the man himself. So just a personal note, I need to take a moment here and tell you something about my own history with Scotland. Because it isn't just a destination I've added to a tour lineup. It's something much older and much more personal than that. I spent time in Scotland as a child, living with my grandmother. And what I remember mostly is the feeling of place and the sense of pride, the particular quality of the light, the way the hills look in the morning when the mist is still sitting on the valleys, the sense that you are walking somewhere that has stories layered into the very ground beneath your feet. Scotland got into my bones when I was young, and it never really left. So when I started building the Scottish Book Club tour, which we're running next June, I wasn't approaching it as a travel product. I was approaching it as a homecoming, as a way of sharing something I have loved my whole life with the women I most want to share it with. And Walter Scott is at the very heart of that love. He is part of why Scotland looks and feels the way it does, why we associate it with the Highland heroes, and tartan, and ruined castles, and the romance of people fighting for something they believed in. He built that world. And he handed it to us. Let's talk about the man behind the myth. Walter Scott was born in Edinburgh in 1771, the son of a lawyer, into a city that was in the middle of one of the most extraordinary cultural explosions in Western history, the Scottish Enlightenment. Edinburgh in the late 18th century was producing thinkers, philosophers, engineers, economists, and writers at a pace that astonished the rest of the world. This was the city of David Hume and Adam Smith. It was a city that believed with tremendous confidence in the power of ideas. But young Walter Scott didn't grow up in the drawing rooms of polite Edinburgh society. As a small child, he contracted polio and was sent to recuperate at his grandfather's farm in the Scottish borders, in the countryside among the shepherds and the farmers, hearing the old ballads of folk tales and legends of the border reivers. He absorbed stories the way other children absorb sunlight. He was, from the very beginning, a collector of voices. He trained as a lawyer, like his father. He practiced law for years. But he was always writing on the side, first poetry, then those extraordinary ballads he'd collected from the countryside, then something entirely new, a historical novel. In 1814, he published Waverley, anonymously. He was embarrassed, he said, to be a serious lawyer writing popular fiction. The novel was set in the Jacobite uprising of 1745, and it caused an absolute sensation. People devoured it. They read it, and they felt they were there, in the Scottish Highlands, in the thick of rebellion, surrounded by characters who felt as real as anyone they'd ever known. He would go on to publish over 24 novels: Rob Roy, The Heart of Midlothian, Ivanhoe, Kenilworth. And by the time he died in 1832, he was arguably the most famous author in the world. Not just in Britain, the world. Goethe admired him. Napoleon reportedly kept his novels on campaign. And in America, his influence was so profound that Mark Twain, who was not a man given to admiration, blamed Scott for essentially causing the Civil War by making Southerners too romantic about lost causes. That's how much power this man had. Now, if you've never read Walter Scott, I want to be honest with you, he is not always an easy read in the way that Jane Austen is an easy read, or the Brontes. His sentences are long, he loves digression. He will stop a perfectly good action sequence to give you 3 pages on the history of a medieval castle, and he will not apologize for it. But here's what I want to say to that. Waverley is actually a genuinely wonderful place to start. It reads in many ways like a template for Outlander. You have an outsider, a young English officer named Edward Waverley, who finds himself in the Scottish Highlands in 1745, swept up in the Jacobite cause, falling under the spell of the landscape and the culture and the people. The romance is not just about a love interest. It is about falling in love with the world. Sound familiar? If you want something more swashbuckling and medieval, Ivanhoe is your book. It gave us the Robin Hood we all pictured in our heads, and it is enormously fun. And if you want to go very Scottish and very deep, The Heart of Midlothian, set in Edinburgh in the early 18th century, is considered by many scholars to be his masterpiece. It is the story of a young woman named Jeanie Deans, who walks from Edinburgh to London on foot to beg a pardon for her sister. It is a story about ordinary courage, and it is absolutely extraordinary. I'll have links to all of these in the show notes. This is the week to pick one up and begin, especially if you've been thinking about joining us on the Scottish Book Club tour. These are books that will make Scotland make sense when you arrive. Let's talk about Scotland and Outlander and the connection that you didn't know you need. Okay, so I want to talk about Outlander now because I know many of you love it, and I want to give you something that will make you love it even more. Diana Gabaldon did not invent the romantic Scottish Highlands. She inherited them. And the person she inherited them from, directly, whether she intended to or not, is Walter Scott. Here's the thing about the Scotland of Outlander. The Highland warriors and their tartan, the fierce clan loyalties, the tragedy of Culloden and the Jacobite cause, the brooding landscapes of purple heather and granite peaks and lochs that seemed to hold secrets. That Scotland was largely Walter Scott's invention. Or, more precisely, it was a real Scotland that Scott took and polished it until it gleamed, and then handed it to the world as an icon. Before Scott, tartan was actually banned in Scotland. The British government passed the Dress Act in 1746, after Culloden, prohibiting Highland dress as a way of suppressing Jacobite culture. It wasn't until 1782 that the ban was lifted, and it was Walter Scott, specifically his orchestration of King George IV's visit to Edinburgh in 1822, who transformed the tartan from a suppressed symbol of rebellion into the beloved official symbol of Scotland that it is today. Scott basically staged the entire royal visit as a Highland pageant. He had the king wear a kilt. He had the Edinburgh establishment dress in tartan. He turned a moment of political ceremony into cultural reinvention. Historians call it the Highland Revival, and it was, depending on your perspective, either a magnificent act of cultural preservation or an enormous romantic fantasy imposed on a much more complicated history. And that tension, between the romance and the reality, is precisely what makes Scott so endlessly interesting. And it is exactly what we are going to dig into with historian Alex Dold next week. I cannot wait for that conversation. Let's talk about Abbotsford, Scott's house. Now, I have to tell you about Abbotsford because it is one of the most extraordinary houses in Britain, and it is the house that Walter Scott built, literally built from his imagination. In 1811, Scott purchased a small farmhouse on the banks of the River Tweed, in the Scottish borders, and he began to transform it over the next 2 decades into something that didn't really have a name before he built it, a literary castle, a Gothic, romantic, turreted, armory-filled, library-crammed fantasy of medieval Scotland made real. He filled it with historical relics, Rob Roy's purse, a lock of Bonnie Prince Charlie's hair, a sword from Waterloo, Mary Queen of Scots' crucifix. He built a library with 9,000 books. He created a house that was itself a work of fiction, a physical expression of his imagination. And then he went essentially bankrupt trying to maintain it, and spent the last years of his life writing frantically novel after novel to pay off his debts. He died at Abbotsford in 1832, and you can still visit it today. When I think about what we're building with the Scottish Book Club tour, Abbotsford is part of the spiritual DNA of everything we're doing, and we'll definitely be visiting. The Scottish borders, Edinburgh's Old Town, the Highlands, the landscapes, these are all places that Scott shaped in the popular imagination, and walking through them with his books in your mind is an extraordinary experience. It is what literary travel is made of. If you want to be part of that, if you've been listening to this episode and feeling the pull, I want to invite you to come with us. You can find us at thebookclubtour.com. The tour is small, the group will be wonderful, and Scotland in late June is, I can tell you from personal experience, something close to paradise. Let's talk about why Walter Scott still matters. I want to end by asking a question that I think is worth sitting with. What does it mean when a writer's fiction becomes more powerful than historical reality? Because that is what happened with Scott. The Scotland he imagined became in many ways the Scotland the world believes in. And for actual Scots, particularly lowland Scots, urban Scots, Scots who never wore a kilt in their lives, this has sometimes been complicated. There is a real tension between the beautiful, heroic, romantic Highland Scotland that Scott gave the world, and the far more textured, sometimes brutal, sometimes very ordinary history of an actual nation. But here's what I keep coming back to. The best historical fiction doesn't just entertain us. It recruits us. It makes us care about a past that would otherwise be invisible to us. I would argue that more people have become curious about Jacobite history, about the Highland clans, and about the real tragedy of Culloden because of Outlander, which is the direct descendant of Scott, than through any school curriculum. And that's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot. Scott was imperfect. His portraits of women are often limited. His Highland heroes are sometimes more a symbol of human being. But he was one of the first writers in history to take ordinary people, farmers, servants, women, the dispossessed, and put them in the center of a story. He believed that the past belonged to everyone, not just kings and generals. And that impulse, that democratic, generous, passionate impulse, runs through everything he wrote. I think we should read him. I think he deserves our attention again. Before I let you go, a reminder that next week I'm sitting down with historian Alex Dold for a conversation about Scottish history and Outlander that I think is going to be one of my favorite episodes I've ever made. We're going to talk about the real history behind the romance, about Culloden and the Jacobites, and about what Scotland's past means for the Scotland of today. If this episode made you curious, next week's is going to answer questions you didn't even know you had. In the meantime, read Walter Scott. Start with Waverley. I've linked it in the show notes, or if you want something shorter, look up some of his border ballads. They're beautiful and eerie, and they'll make you feel like you're standing on a windswept hillside at dusk. And if Scotland is calling to you, if this episode has stirred something, come to thebookclubtour.com and find out about our Scottish book club tour in June 2027. I would genuinely love to take you there. Thanks so much for listening to the Brit Lit Book Club. If you're enjoying the show, please take a moment to leave a review. It truly helps us reach more British literature lovers just like you. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can find us on Instagram at The Book Club Tour and head to our website, thebookclubtour.com, to see upcoming book club tours. Well, my tea's getting cold, so until next time, keep reading and stay curious.